During the early 1950s, there were two dominant teams in the National Football League that vied for championships year after year. 1954 is no exception to this, and Jonathan Knight comes to tell us about the 1954 championship of the National Football League, coming up in just a moment.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to our championship series. Man, are we having a great time talking to experts about the National Football League championships before the Super Bowl, and some great teams, some great players, some great items of historic interest in the game of football in the National Football League, and that is no exception tonight. We have a guest who is definitely qualified for the champion of the season we're going to be talking about tonight, 1954. He is a returning guest, and I'm embarrassed to say it's been 4 years since we have had Jonathan Knight here in the Pig Pen. Jonathan, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thank you, Darren. It's great to be back.
Yeah, Jonathan, you have, I think we counted before we talked, you have 5 books on the Cleveland Browns history, and definitely qualified to talk about this 54 team, which is at the pinnacle of probably the Browns seasons. This is a great team that they have in the 50s and great run that they have. So what have you been doing since 2021 when we last talked to you about your book that was out, Paul Brown's Ghost?
Paul Brown's Ghost. Yeah, that was a while ago. Just kind of like figuring out the next project. I did have another book come out, and not related to the Browns or sports, ironically, about the totally out of left field, out of related to the coincidences between the Abraham Lincoln and John Kennedy assassinations. So very, very much a left turn, but it was a lot of fun to do. Just kind of exploring that, something that I've always been interested in. So that came out, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. In the meantime, just kind of noodling between projects, figuring out what's going to come next.
Yeah, I hear you. There's so much out there to write about and so many interesting things. And definitely that Kennedy and Lincoln coincidences are very interesting. So I'll have to make sure I get a copy of that. I love that kind of stuff. That's good stuff. And readers, we will get some links in the show notes of both YouTube and on the podcast notes and on pigskindispatch.com. Get you hooked up into Jonathan's work and get his books, including the one he just talked about, and some of these Cleveland Browns books we're going to be talking about here, I'm sure, in a few minutes. Now, Jonathan, we are up to 1954 and the Cleveland Browns. This is kind of a unique situation because I don't think it's ever happened before or since where the same two teams met in a championship game in the National Football League 3 times in a row. It's happened twice before, but 3 times, and that's what we have here in 54.
Yeah, and it really defined the whole decade. I mean, clearly the Browns and the Detroit Lions, who they faced 3 straight times, and then again in 1957. Like, these were the teams of the 50s. This was a dueling dynasty, like which one was going to be the team of the 50s. And the irony of this was while they were both great teams and they played some memorable games, the Lions just had the Browns number throughout the decade. Whether it was championships, they won 3 of the 4, or even in the regular season, the Browns just could not beat the Lions. They could beat everybody else. They just couldn't beat the Lions, except for this 1954 championship, which was memorable for that, if nothing else.
Yeah, it definitely was. And we're not sure what happened that year in between that 55 because neither team made the championship and then they both returned a year later. I'm sorry, 55 or 56.
56.
I lost track. 56 is when the Giants won. Yeah, so it's interesting that they must have took a year off. They got too tired from playing all those games and needed a rest. Must be
wanted to give somebody else a chance.
That's the way the National Football League team.
Yeah, it's all about parity and
else
balance. It's very democratic.
Right. So, what can you tell us about the 54 season? What's sort of the temperature of the league at this time?
Well, it's interesting for the Browns specifically because, as you mentioned, they had on a run, through 54. Joining the NFL in 1950, coming from the All-America Football Conference through the late 40s, they were on a run of 10 straight years which they would reach their league championship game. whether they won or not,
Amazing.
what happened that, which is amazing. Like you talk about three teams or teams meeting 3 straight years in the championship. That, I mean, we will never see that. We will never see a team reach their championship 10 straight years. This would have been the ninth of those 10 years. And while they had entered the league as a phenomenon in 1950, winning the league in their first season, which is astonishing in itself, as you mentioned, the next 3 years they knocked on the door and just couldn't win. Lost close games to the Rams in 51, the Lions in 52, and then again in 53. So they while certainly impressive, certainly successful, they were not a dynasty. Like they were not yet poised to be what we remembered them as in the 50s. They, in a way, they were kind of a disappointment, at least those last 3 years, coming right up on the cusp of winning championships with some really good teams. And 1954 was really a transitional year for the Browns. A lot of the guys that had led them those first 2 years, and even in the 40s in the All-America League, had retired or been traded. It was a transitional year, and the expectations were maybe a little bit lower. Certainly, there was an understanding that this was not going to be one of the great Browns teams that had preceded. So there was certainly an expectation of success because there had been nothing else with this team. But at the same time, it was, well, this is sort of probably the twilight of this run. And going into that season, nobody really knew what they were going to see. And what they saw very early on was a disappointment. They lost 2 of their first 3 games. And one of the ironic things about it was what might have saved them, ironically, was the 1954 Indians, the Cleveland Indians in Major League Baseball, who I'm very intimate with this subject. I'd written a book about the 54 Indians, and everything that went on in Cleveland in 1954. A lot going on, sort of the capital of America in a lot of ways. Cleveland was in 1954, a huge year for the city in sports and beyond that. But the Indians that year set an American League record for victories in a season with 111 in a 154 game season, cruised to the American League pennant, were expected to go on and conquer the World Series and start their own dynasty. Stunningly got swept by the New York Giants in the World Series, defined by Willie Mays' great catch. Everyone's always seen that. And that sort of was the end of the Indians for about 40 years. We didn't see them. But all of that by way of saying that how that affected the Browns was, as the Indians went on this run, they went into the World Series. That first weekend in October would have been week 2 of the NFL season. The Indians would be hosting games 3, 4, and 5 of the World Series that weekend. And the Browns were scheduled to host the Detroit Lions in week 2 of the NFL season. The Browns had started in week 1 getting blown out by a Philadelphia team that, by all appearances, did not appear to be anything special, sort of underlining the general thought that this Browns team wasn't going to be that good. And now all of a sudden they've got to play the 2-time defending world champions the next weekend. And it didn't look great. 0-2 looked very, very promising. It looked like that was going to happen. But with the Indians now hosting the World Series, the decision was made, okay, we can't do this. We can't have a World Series game and an NFL game in the same stadium. Remember, this was back in the days when the Browns and the Indians shared Cleveland Stadium. We can't do both in the same day. We need to kick this Browns-Lions game to the end of the year. So they tacked it on to the end of the schedule. And that, in some ways, might have saved the Browns. Like, had they lost that game, they would have been 0-2. They wound up coming back the following week and winning against the Chicago Cardinals, then lost again badly in their what was their third game, got blown out by the Pittsburgh Steelers. So in reality, they were 1-2. They very likely could have been 1-3, and then perhaps the bottom would have fallen out. Like that would have been too deep a hole for them to dig out of. So by kicking that game to the bottom of the schedule, it gave them just a little bit of wiggle room. So they lost 2 of those first 3, righted the ship, won 8 in a row, and then played what turned out to be a meaningless game at the end of the season. Both the Lions and Browns had clinched their division and respective divisions and knew they were going to be playing one another the following week in the NFL championship. So it was really a meaningless game at the very end of the season. They did lose the game to finish the season at 9-3, but at that point, no harm done. Like it really didn't matter. But had that game been earlier, had that been scheduled or had been played when it was scheduled, who knows? Like that might have really dropped the bottom out of the season. And the irony of the whole story is that the Indians, as I mentioned, were swept by the Giants, losing game 4 on Saturday, game 5 on Sunday. Nothing happened at Cleveland Stadium. So they could have played that game all along. And it may have changed the course of the entire Browns championship season.
Yeah, I'll tell you, I think they had a percentage and recently. I don't know if it's held true back then, but teams that had 3 losses in their first 4 games in National Football League in 2024 only had like a 5% chance of making
Yeah,
the postseason. And there's a lot more teams going into postseason now than there was then. There were only
right.
2 back then, so
Right.
probably
That
even lower
and the fact that
percentage. So
the season was much shorter. We're talking about 12 game seasons back then.
yeah,
So, you
you
lose 3 of your first 4, you've dug yourself all, even at 1 and
25% of your
2.
games are losses now.
Exactly. And even
Yeah.
at 1 and 2, at that point, Philadelphia was 4-1. The Giants were 3-1. So they were 2.5 games out of first place with a quarter of the season gone. And that's tough ground to make up in football.
Yeah, and if you sit there and think about it, I mean, if that schedule holds true, those are the 2 teams that the Browns, who have been in, 3 straight NFL championships at that point, before the 54 season, those are their 2 opponents. The Lions and the Eagles are who they played in their championship NFL championship game. So that's a pretty tough way to start out, even though the Eagles are, 3 years removed from their last championship appearance. So it's
Mhm.
still, that's a tough sled to go here. They must have made the scheduler a little bit upset.
Yeah,
Who
that's
was
right.
Burt Bell, I think, at that time. I think
I think that's right.
he had
Yeah, he would
scheduled
do
it
it
at that
himself.
time.
That's right. In the early 50s. Yeah.
Yeah, we had an opportunity to talk to his son Upton on a couple occasions, and Upton would recant how his father would put papers all over the kitchen, hang them on the wall. And that's how he did the NFL schedule. He'd just be writing all
Yeah.
over the place and
I love
making
hearing
it
those
work
stories.
out. So
I
yeah, it's
love
kind of
hearing those stories. Yeah.
yeah, pretty cool thing. So who were some of the Browns stars in 1954? Who are the guys they count on?
Well, first and foremost, you talk about Otto Graham. I mean, he was certainly the star of the team, the best player. He was the franchise quarterback in an era that it really was not about quarterbacks. There were stars, but the football was, as you and obviously your listeners know, was very, very different back then. And certainly by looking at the statistics, there was a lot of numbers that aren't going to blow your mind. They're not really comparable to what we see today or even what we saw 20 or 30 years ago. But Otto Graham was no doubt about it, as we mentioned before, like you play 10 years, you play in 10 championships. That's remarkable. I mean, that had no quarterback has ever done that. No quarterback ever will do that. So he was very much the Tom Brady of his day. So you start with him. He had been there since the beginning. Um, he was absolutely the heart of the team. The irony is, as I mentioned before, like a lot of the guys who had been the signature people for the Browns the previous few years were gone. Marion Motley had gone. So at this point, you still had recognizable names. Of course, there were talented players: Ray Renfro, Dub Jones, Lou Groza, of course, was still around. He still had many years to go in his wonderful
Mhm.
career. Dante Lavelli was still there, but they really didn't have the real name star power that you saw in 1950, for example, when they came in. So it was very much it was a lunch bucket type of team. And they got the job done and won not so much with individual stardom or individual statistics or even offense. Like they won with defense. They were a very, very gritty, very dirty team that did what they needed to do and got the job done.
Yeah, that's I mean, remarkable names that you say there. It's, basically the walls of Canton that you're talking about there
Yeah.
with those stars. And the Lions are equally talented. To play in 3 straight championships, you have to have some star power on that side too. And they're well coached. They have a strong quarterback. They have good offense, a fair defense, and very 2 formidable foes playing in this championship game.
Yeah, and really cool too that it was very much a battle of Lake Erie, like very much an Ohio team against a Michigan team, Detroit and Cleveland. A stone's throw away from each other. That these were the powerhouses of football in the heart of the Midwest. I mean, that was really cool. You really got to see that, and it genuinely was a rivalry. Like just the cities alone were a rivalry, and then, of course the teams just took that to another level.
Yeah, I guess I never really thought about that, the Ohio-Michigan rivalry we have in college, and now you have it on a professional level at
Right.
3 years in a row. That is kind of a cool aspect of it. There was kind of an interesting thing. I'm a former football official, so I always try to look at the rules and some rules that impacted. And the big rule, which doesn't sound all that important, but it's the first year that the National Football League allowed the offense to ask for a new football on a rainy day or muddy field, and which I'm sure had some impact back in those seasons because nobody played on AstroTurf, nobody played on carpet. It was all grass, mud. Cleveland's case, I'm sure it was
Mostly
the
mud.
way, yeah, the mud playing in the infield of the Indians.
Yeah, yeah.
I know going to the Cleveland Municipal in the 70s when I was a kid to watch a game, and the infield was definitely there all football season.
Oh yeah.
So an interesting aspect to throw in there that the NFL did that after all those years of playing the way they did with one football, and whenever the officials decided to change it.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, these little things that you hear about, changes that we just never either never think about or just never really considered. Like, yeah, there was a time when that wasn't the case. Same in baseball, like changing the baseball out. Like now we see it all the time, but there was a time when you'd use one ball for the whole game. Like we wouldn't be switching them out.
Right, and it sounds silly to us now. Well, why wouldn't you do that?
Yeah,
It's
right.
but the
Like very
thought
different.
process was different. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's definitely. So who was the competition? The NFL is broken into two divisions or conferences. I'm not sure what they called them. Then they kept changing the names of them constantly throughout the 40s and 50s. But who is the Browns' major competition in the East?
So and that's as I mentioned before, like Philadelphia kind of surprised folks, like came out of the woodwork a little bit, got off to a great start, started 4-0, which I think surprised a lot of people and early on thought, well, wow, this might be a changing of the guard. They tailed off as the season went on. The Giants, of course, the other big team of the 50s, they were right there. They wound up, I think, finishing second. Philadelphia and the Giants were sort of neck and neck with the Browns after they surpassed them. But those were the main two. One of the, I don't know if it's a blessing, but one of the reasons why the Browns were able to string together that 8-game winning streak, they won the games they needed to win, obviously. Like there were key games against the Eagles and Giants, three really in that stretch that they needed to win and they won. So they won the big games, but they also, the rest of the division, really, there was a drop off after that, let's be honest. And they took care of business. I mean, in a big way. Like you look at some of the games, like they just mowed through everybody else, including the largest win in franchise history. They beat the Washington Redskins 62-3 in that stretch, which still to this
Wow.
day is the largest margin of victory in Browns history. So, they took care of business. The rest of the division was not up to par, and they did not screw around. They were like, we need to win these games, and they did. So it wasn't a tight race. There were, as I said, there were some key games that they won on the road. They won in bad weather conditions, and they won with defense, and they stepped up and won those big games, which is what championship teams do.
Yeah, and over in the West, Detroit's fighting off a hard charge from the Chicago Bears all year. San Francisco 49ers are right in there till the end. And the Rams are about 500. They sort of lost a little bit about their luster from they had in previous years. So some competitive conferences going until, like you said, the final week that they both had it locked up and they were playing each other. So probably like we do now, probably rested the players and let the guys on the bench play the game out, and doesn't really matter at that point.
In a snowstorm as well. That was another factor there. It was
Oh,
a heavy
really?
snow right before Christmas, so it was right away. It was like this is this is gonna be, there's very little we can take from this game and assess because it was not only were the elements were against them, but as you said, like they're resting players, they're not going to show their hand. They know they're going to play again the following week for all the marbles. So that was really an exercise in futility that week.
I'm sure the ball boys were busy that day because with that ball change thing, that snowy day, I'm sure the quarterbacks were calling for the
Oh
ball
yeah.
almost every play. So yeah, very interesting. So take us into the championship game. How does these two teams are definitely the tops of their divisions or conferences. They're meeting in the championship third time in a row. Star players all over, great coaching. What happens in this game?
And this is one of the more interesting games really in Browns history because as we've alluded to, like the ramp up for this was, oh my gosh, the Lions have the Browns number. So even though the game was in Cleveland, they would alternate every year through this era between the divisions who would host and from one year to the next. So it was in Cleveland, so there was that. Even knowing that, hosting the championship game, the Browns were not the favorite. The Lions were still favored, largely because everybody in America knew that the Lions just had the Browns number. They'd won the previous two championship games. The Browns had yet to beat the Lions, even in the regular season. And they not only did they beat them, and many of the games were close, but they just seemed to have a way to bring out the worst in the Browns. Otto Graham he had played 4 games against the Lions going into this game, had not thrown a touchdown pass. in the previous year's championship games, he completed 2 passes. Like this is what we're talking about. Otto Graham was the best quarterback in the game at the time, and he was completely shut down. He could not do anything. So there was this sense that just like, boy, the Lions just have the Browns number. There's nothing the Browns can do. So there was, I don't even know if it was cautious optimism. No one expected the Browns to come out and win this game by 46 points, as it turned out to be. This is one of the most stunning turns of events, one of the more surprising moments in Browns history. Nobody expected that to happen.
Yeah, so how did this happen? What did they change? Did they have a philosophical change of how they played Detroit, or surprise
A little
tactics?
bit, to be honest, I always have looked at this and as I've researched it, there was a little bit of that. I mean, to be sure, there were adjustments made before every time they played the Lions. Paul Brown, one of the masterminds of coaching then and for years to come, certainly would always make adjustments and would study and try to find out why were we not able to be successful the way we were against all of their teams and all their weeks. So there was that going on, and to be sure, there were adjustments made just as there had been in previous encounters with the Lions. I've always had the point of view there's like this was an example that we see in sports of sort of the fate stepping in to balance the scales. This was just like these are two teams that are really, really evenly matched over time, over the 5 or 6 years that they were really at the top of the league. And there was, even though Detroit had the better of this series and won most of the games, they weren't that much better than the Browns, indicated by they generally weren't blowing the Browns out. They just always seem to get the breaks. They always seem to get, and they deserve them. Like to be sure, they played well enough to win all of those games, but everything just kind of went their way, like flipping a coin, like you get heads 6
Mhm.
times in a row. This was the day where it's like, okay, the scales of sports said, no, 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 that's enough. Like everything else is going to go, everything for the last 5 years has gone your way. Today, it's going to go their way. And it very much was like that. And it did, like it just snowballed. The Browns scored 56 points. They hadn't scored 56 points in the 4 games against the Lions combined. A lot of turnovers, a lot of mistakes. Otto Graham played one of the greatest games of his career. He threw for 3 touchdowns after not throwing for any in the previous 4 games against Detroit and ran for 3. He was responsible for 6 touchdowns. And that's a
Phew.
guy that's fate turning and just like winking at you like, yeah, what happened before those previous 5, that wasn't you. That wasn't quite fair or balanced. We're going to balance it out today. So you can argue whether or not it's like, well, is it better to lose 2 championship games and any number or 3, actually, if you throw in the later one in 57, to get it all back in one day? I don't know. But that's, to me, that's what happened. Like, there's no other real way to explain it other than, yeah, it was just one of those days where the scales just tipped the other way and it all balanced out. 3 years of bad luck just balanced out in one day.
Yeah, and that had to be, I mean, a mild surprise to experts that had been following the National Football League, like you said, for reasons of Detroit being slightly favored in there. Something else I found kind of interesting, going through these championship games and just looking at, who were the player awards going to. They didn't have but maybe a handful of them going out in the NFL at that time. But there's only one player between the Browns and the Lions that has any recognition really the end of the year, and that's Groza, who the Sporting News gave the NFL Player of the Year. Everything else is out on the West Coast. It's the 49ers and the Rams collecting, Van Brocklin's the passing leader, Joe Perry's the rushing leader, receiving leaders Bob Boyd of the Rams, and UPI gave Joe Perry the NFL Most Valuable Player. So kind of interesting. Usually the championship teams and the teams that are at the top usually have the stars and get most of the accolades. So that's kind of a unique situation.
Yeah, and definitely says something, as I mentioned before, about sort of the gritty nature of these teams. These were not, even though they had star players, they were not about statistics. They weren't going to light up a scoreboard. Very similar to some of the great teams we saw later, like the Pittsburgh Steelers of the 70s, so on and so forth. Like they're very gritty. They get the job done. It may not be pretty, but they're going to win. And that is a lot, like even Otto Graham. You look at him and the year he had an amazing game in the championship. Everyone still knew he was probably the best overall quarterback in the game. He had 11 touchdown passes and 17 interceptions. 17 interceptions in 12 games. That's a
Yeah.
lot. Like that's not, by any modern standard, that's a terrible season. but he was middle of the pack statistically. So again, sort of balance, adjusting for inflation, what statistics mean. But that's the kind of thing you would see with these kind of like grit. And even now, like that's not as true as it was for the era. We see that now in football and in all sports. And one of the interesting things about this, particularly from the Browns' point of view, is that the 1954 team in that run, specifically from 50 to 55 in the NFL, where the Browns were in the championship every year. They won 3 of them. The 54 team was probably the worst of that run.
Mm.
Like they were almost certainly worse than the 3 previous teams, Browns teams that had lost the championship. And we see this in sports, right? Like a lot of times, no matter what the sport, like when you have a really strong franchise that goes on a run where they're a title contender for a series of years. It's funny how often the best overall seasons or the best individual teams in that run don't win championships. And the
Mhm.
lesser, air quote, lesser teams that win less games or have the injuries or don't have the pretty season that they set the records and have all kinds of great statistics, they do end up winning. And that's just indicative of like the core of the team. And it's as much as it's great to, go 14-2 and have a quarterback who throws 40 touchdown passes. That's wonderful and that looks great, but it doesn't always translate into postseason success and or into a championship. It's the things we don't always see. It's the offensive line, it's the defensive line, it's the gritty things, it's the endurance of the special teams, it's the ability to persevere through the playoffs. And a lot of times that'll happen because the team is experienced, because the team believes in itself, even if it hasn't had a glittery type of season. Like these are very lunch bucket, as I mentioned, lunch bucket types of teams. They're going to show up every year, and you do not want to face them in the postseason because no matter what their record was, no matter how many games they lost, you don't want to deal with them once you hit the postseason trying to play for a championship.
Yeah, that's an interesting point you bring up, how these teams just when they're the down years are when they seem to have their best. I guess a modern equivalent would probably be the undefeated Patriots losing to the
Yeah,
gritty Giants, or maybe when Tampa Bay beat Mahomes and that Chiefs team, which was probably maybe their strongest when they still had Tyreek Hill and Hunt's running like crazy. Might
yeah,
be better than some of the more recent Chiefs teams.
yeah, yeah.
So yeah, very interesting point. Well, we mentioned earlier that you have some great books on Brown's history. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the books and where folks can get them at?
Yeah, I mean, everything's available on Amazon. You can still be able to look me up or look up some of the titles and be able to get them all pretty easily. So it runs the gamut. I mean, my very first book was about the Cardiac Kids, the 1980 Browns, which any Browns fan can tell you was still probably the most beloved individual team in Browns history, or individual season anyway in Browns history. That was my first one. That was over 20 years ago now. And then the rest of them just sort of it runs the gamut. As I said, I wrote one about the late 1980s Browns, the Bernie Kosar era, and the drive, the fumble, that whole era, which I grew up with, which was great to write about. The one that pertains perhaps, or the couple that pertain to this topic, one called Classic Browns, which counts down the 50 greatest games in Browns history, of which the 1954
Mm.
championship is in the top 10. Another one is the Browns Bible, which came out in 2013 and actually went through every single game in Browns history up to that time and gave a quick summary and a box score and collected all kinds of other great stories in there. So
Mhm.
those all kind of captured those two at least. And the Classic Browns came out in 2 editions. A few years later, I did a second edition and added some games and moved some things around. So that was a lot of fun to do and sparked a lot of debate and discussion, which was the point amongst Browns fans, which was wonderful. And then, as we talked about earlier, Paul Brown's Ghost, which was not only about Paul Brown and the history of the Browns, but as it connects to the Cincinnati Bengals, as they really are, because of Paul Brown. These two franchises are stepbrothers, and just sort of the fascinating nuances of that relationship and how it began and how it's played out and how it goes on today, and how, in a way, that both of those teams are, sort of cursed in a way by their founder for all the mistakes and kind of silly things that they have done and how much they've departed from the compass that Paul Brown had established into both franchises, and why they just can't seem to catch a break on the field and off through history ever since he passed in 1991.
Yeah, very interesting. And folks, football historians, if you want to, catch, some Browns history, there's some great resources right there to check out. And like I said, we'll have the links in the show notes of both the YouTube and the audio podcast and on Pigskin Dispatch. We'll get you hooked up with Jonathan that way, or go on Amazon and look up his author's page, Jonathan Knight with a K. Jonathan, we really appreciate you coming on here and sharing this great history once again with us. And I promise you, I won't make it so long again before you're a guest on here, because you're a very interesting guest and have a lot of knowledge to share and preserve football history. And we thank you.
Oh, thank you, Darren. It's my pleasure.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.